Henry Mercer had worked security at Black Hollow Asylum for nearly 20 years. The pay was bad, the hours were worse, and the place, it was hell on earth. It wasn't the screams that got to him, or the patients rocking back and forth in the dark, whispering to people who weren't there. It wasn't even the old rotting smell of disinfectant that clung to the walls like death itself. It was the feeling. Like something watched him from the shadows, something hungry, something that didn't belong. Tonight was Henry's last shift before retirement, and he had one rule: never walk the third floor alone. The asylum had 3 levels. The first floor held the harmless ones, the ones who mostly stared out windows and hummed old songs. The second floor had the violent patients, the ones who needed to be strapped down and medicated. But the third floor? Nobody went there unless they had to. There was only one patient left on that floor. Room 309, no name, just a number. And the record said he had been there for 50 years, but Henry had been working there for 20. And in all that time, he had never seen anyone go. No nurses, no doctors, no food trays sliding under the door. And yet, someone inside was still breathing. It started around 2:13 a.m., always the same time. A voice, hoarse and dry, whispering through the intercom. Henry. He froze. No one should know his name. The intercom system had been shut off years ago. Cut off after an old doctor hanged himself in the control room. But the voice came through anyway. Henry, come upstairs. A cold chill crawled up his spine. He turned to the monitors. Every screen showed static, except for one. The third floor, hallway. The camera was live and the door to room 309 was wide open. He should have called the police. He should have locked himself in the break room and waited for morning. But something pulled him forward. Something deep, like an itch in his brain. He climbed the stairs one by one, flashlight trembling in his grip. The hallway was wrong. Longer than it should be, stretching into the dark. The air was thick, damp, like the walls were breathing. Then came the footsteps, slow, dragging, coming from the end of the hall. Henry lifted his flashlight and something moved, a shape, standing just outside room 309, too tall, too thin. And when it turned to look at him, it had no face. Henry stumbled back, heart slamming against his ribs. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. And then, it whispered, "Help me." Its voice was wrong. Not human. Like a dozen voices speaking at once. Henry ran. Down the hall, down the stairs, slamming into the security office and locking the door behind him. But the monitors were still on, and the camera for the security office switched to live feed. He was looking at himself, sitting in the chair. But he wasn't moving, wasn't breathing, because he wasn't himself anymore. The next morning, Henry Mercer didn't clock out. He just sat there staring at the monitors. A new guard found him, shaking his shoulder. But Henry didn't blink, didn't breathe. His eyes were gone, just empty sockets staring into the screens. And on the third floor camera, room 309's door was open. Inside sat a man in a security uniform, smiling, waiting. And when the new guard turned off the monitors, the intercom crackled to life. "Come upstairs." Days passed, then weeks. Henry Mercer was gone, but Black Hollow Asylum remained. Guards came and went, but no one spoke of what had happened. No one asked why his name was still listed on the roster. One night, Officer Daniels, new to the job, sat in the security room sipping his stale coffee. He didn't know the stories yet, didn't know the whispers. At 2:13 a.m., the intercom crackled. Daniels, he, turned to the monitors. The third floor camera flickered to life. The door to room 309 was open, and inside, a figure in a security uniform sat smiling, waiting. "Come upstairs." Dr. Nathaniel Carter had spent most of his career in the sterile, dimly lit hallways of Ashwood Asylum, a crumbling institution tucked away in the woods, far from the prying eyes of the world. People whispered about Ashwood, but only in hushed tones. Patients never truly recovered. Staff turnover was high, and sometimes, just sometimes, people disappeared without a trace. Nathaniel had heard the rumors, of course, the stories about the South Wing, the part of the hospital that had been shut down decades ago. They said something still lived there, something that wasn't human. But Nathaniel had never believed in ghosts or demons until tonight, because tonight he was the only doctor on duty, and the South Wing's lights had just turned on. The night shift was never busy. The few patients who were lucid enough to talk mostly kept to themselves, wrapped in the numbing embrace of heavy medication. The others, the violent ones, they were locked away. Nathaniel had just settled into his office when the phone rang. It was an old landline, one that was supposed to be disconnected. Slowly, he lifted the receiver. Dr. Carter speaking. At first, there was only static. Then, a whisper. Come find me, doctor. The line went dead. Nathaniel stared at the receiver, his heart hammering against his ribs. That voice, low, rasping, wasn't anyone he knew. And yet, it had sounded familiar. He should have ignored it. Should have stayed in his office until morning. But something pulled him forward. An old curiosity. A doctor's need to investigate. Nathaniel grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the hallway. The South Wing loomed ahead, its entrance barricaded by rusted chains and a sign that read, "No entry." The locks had long since rusted over. No one had been inside for decades. But as Nathaniel stood there, the chains snapped apart with a soft clink, like invisible hands had just unlocked the door. The door swung open, a single footprint in the dust, led inside and then another and another, as if someone, or something, had been waiting for him. The South Wing smelled of mildew and rot, the walls streaked with something dark. Old hospital beds lay overturned, their restraints still in place. And then, at the end of the hall, room 6, the door stood ajar. Inside, the bed was occupied. Nathaniel's breath caught. That wasn't possible. There were no patients here, not anymore. And yet someone was lying under the sheets, motionless. Nathaniel stepped closer, his fingers trembling as he reached for the blanket. And when he pulled it back, the bed was empty. But a voice behind him whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." Nathaniel spun around. The room was empty, but something was wrong. His skin prickled, the air heavy with something unseen. And then he saw it, the mirror on the wall. It was old, cracked, and in its reflection, Nathaniel wasn't alone. A figure stood behind him, tall, shadowed, watching, and its face was his own, but it was grinning. And he wasn't! Nathaniel ran, back down the hallway, past the empty rooms, past the shadows that slithered along the walls. The door to the South Wing loomed ahead, but before he could reach it, the lights flickered out. In the darkness, something whispered, "You can't leave. You're one of us now." A hand, cold, clammy, gripped his wrist, and Nathaniel Carter screamed. The next morning, the head nurse found his office empty. No sign of Dr. Carter, no record of him clocking out, just an old patient file left on his desk. The name on it, Nathaniel. Carter, admitted, October 12, 1964. Diagnosis, delusional psychosis, claims to be a doctor. The head nurse sighed and closed the file. Just another patient who had lost his mind in the night. And deep in the South Wing, a man in a doctor's coat sat in room 366, staring at his own reflection, smiling, waiting, because he had a new patient to treat. And soon, someone else would come looking for him, just like he had. Clara stood in front of the massive, aging building, a few steps away from the hospital's entrance. Stonehaven Psychiatric Hospital had seen better days. Its high stone walls were covered in ivy, and the windows seemed to blink out at her like hollow eyes. She'd heard the rumors. There were whispers in the halls about the patients who never seemed to leave, the strange occurrences in the dark corners of the ward, the eerie quiet that settled over the hospital after hours. But those were just stories, weren't they? Clara, young and optimistic, didn't believe in ghosts or superstitions. She'd spent years training to become a nurse, and she had a job to do. This was a prestigious hospital after all. She'd made it to the night shift, where the real work happened. As she stepped inside, the first thing she noticed was the smell. It was a mixture of antiseptic and something old, like a scent that clung to the walls, embedded deep within the fabric of the building. Clara shook it off, stepping past the reception desk where the night guard, a grizzled man named Dan, sat reading a newspaper. "Welcome to your first night," he said with a half smile, not looking up from his paper. "Thanks, Dan," Clara replied, her voice steady, even though she could feel the nervous energy swirling inside her. Night shifts weren't easy, especially in a place like this, but she had trained for this. The head nurse, Margaret, met her at the nurse's station. Margaret was older, with graying hair pulled into a tight bun, and a look in her eyes that suggested she had seen everything this place could throw at her and more. "Clara, glad to have you here. The ward's quiet tonight, but don't let that fool you. It can get strange when the moon's high. Stay on your toes." Clara nodded, eager to get started. She followed Margaret down a long corridor, the fluorescent lights flickering above them. The hall was eerily silent, the only sound the echo of their footsteps. Margaret led her to the west wing of the hospital, the section that housed the long-term patients, those with the most severe mental disorders. The silent ward, as the staff called it. Patients who had been here for years, locked away from the world. "Remember, Clara," Margaret said, pausing outside a heavy metal door. "We don't interact too much with the patients here. They're not like the others. Some of them are capable of terrifying things. Just keep a distance." Clara swallowed hard, but nodded. The first patient room was a shared space with two patients, Mr. Graham and Ms. Laura. Both were sitting in chairs, staring out the window. "Don't worry about them," Margaret added. "Just make sure they're settled, then we can get you oriented to the rest of the shift." Clara followed Margaret's instructions and helped settle the patients, administering their medication and making sure their vital signs were stable. Nothing out of the ordinary, at least that's what Clara thought. As she worked, the shadows seemed to deepen, the walls closing in just slightly. Then she heard it. A whisper. It was soft at first, a faint sound in the back of her mind. She paused and glanced around. "Clara," it said again, this time louder, clearer. She spun around, her heart racing, but the hallway was empty. The other nurses had long gone, leaving her to the silence of the night. It was nothing, she told herself, just her mind playing tricks. She had been working for hours, and the exhaustion was starting to set in. But then, the whisper came again, this time from behind her. "Clara!" Her breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly. Standing just a few feet away, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, and dressed in what looked like an old hospital gown. The face was obscured by long, greasy hair, but Clara could see the eyes, pale, hollow, lifeless. Her pulse hammered in her chest. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The figure stepped forward, and in a voice that sounded like 1,000 people whispering at once, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here, Clara." The voice echoed in her head, sending chills down her spine. Clara stumbled backward, her mind reeling. This wasn't happening. There had to be some explanation. Maybe it was a patient who had gotten out of their room, or maybe she was just too tired. But when she looked again, the figure was gone. Clara's hands shook as she returned to the nurse's station, trying to convince herself it was all a hallucination. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The patients in the silent ward, there was something off about them. The eerie stillness in the air seemed to thicken as the night wore on. She looked at the clock. It was almost 2 a.m. She'd made her rounds, administered meds, and checked vital signs, but the atmosphere in the ward was becoming heavier, more suffocating. It was as if the building itself was alive, watching her. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Then the phone at the nurse's station rang. Clara hesitated. Night shifts were always quiet. No one ever called this late. She picked up the receiver. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was raspy, barely audible. "Clara." The connection cut off. She hung up, trying to steady her breathing. Her fingers were icy against the receiver. Something was wrong. Something terribly wrong. She glanced up at the clock again. 10 a.m. The same time as the first whisper. Then she heard it again. Clara. This time, it was different. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a plea filled with desperation. She stood, her heart hammering in her chest. Slowly, she walked down the hallway toward the source of the voice. At the end of the hall was room 312, the only patient on the ward who had been there longer than any other. Dr. Simon Hargrove. He had been the chief psychiatrist here, decades ago, before something happened, something no one talked about. He was locked away in this room, isolated, never to be seen again, but tonight his door was slightly ajar. Clara's hand shook as she pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark, but she could make out a figure sitting in the far corner of the room. "Dr. Hargrove," she whispered, her voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. Clara stepped closer. The air was thick, oppressive, and cold. Then she saw it. A photograph framed on the floor, staring up at her. It was a picture of Dr. Hargrove standing next to a woman Clara didn't recognize. Both of them were smiling, happy. But the woman's eyes were empty, her smile too wide. Clara picked it up and turned it over. Written on the back in faded ink were the words, "We're all trapped here." Before Clara could process this, the door slammed shut behind her. The room felt like it was closing in. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps. She couldn't remember how she had gotten here. She only knew she had to leave. She had to get out. But when she turned, the room was no longer the same. The walls seemed to bend and stretch, and the air grew thick with a stifling silence. The whispers returned, louder this time, swirling around her. "Clara." She turned back to the corner where Dr. Hargrove had been, but now there was only darkness. Then she saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its body long and stretched, like something that didn't belong. It was Dr. Hargrove, but not as he had been. His eyes were hollow, his face twisted in a grotesque grin. He whispered, "We're all trapped here, Clara. You'll never leave." Before she could scream, the lights flickered and went out. The next morning, the sun rose over Stonehaven Psychiatric Hospital, casting long shadows over the courtyard. Clara never made it out of the hospital. They found her later, collapsed in the hallway, her eyes wide with terror. She had tried to leave, to escape, but something had kept her there. And in the silent ward, there were 2 empty rooms now, Dr. Hargrove's and Clara's.